Hi everyone, welcome to the sequel of Animal Migration in a part of Behaviour Ecology, and today we will talk about every taxa separately and their migration habits and how do they do it. For the beginning, we will talk about the tiniest of all the creatures we'll talk about today, and it's the vertical migration of plankton, of course, in the sea. What happens here is that the greatest concentration occur near the surface during the night and the greater depth during the day. So that's why it's called vertical migration, because basically it goes up and down. See, like this, you can see the scheme, nice scheme here. It is evident that vertical migration basically has evolved independently in every single major group of planktonic animals. Different stages of the life history migrated to a greater or lesser extent. So, for example, in this species of copepod calanus, early copepod stages display little vertical movement, while adults move over several meters. Although there may be considerably individual variations, for example, individuals for the freshwater copepod of Dioptamus gracilis, so-called in Latin, captured near the surface tended to aggregate near the top when placed in the submerged tube in the daylight, while those captured near 20 meters of depth tend to move downwards. So they have some logic in their movement pattern. Several observations suggest that light is the major proximate factor influencing vertical migration, with the organisms rising in dim light and sinking in bright. An intuitively appealing theory regarding the adaptiveness of vertical migration is that it is a response to predation. Selective advantage of moving to greater depth during the day is obvious, so the predation pressure is less where visibility is low, of course. So another explanation could be the metabolic efficiency that results from residing at a cool depth during the day and at a burst of feeding at night of phytoplanktonic density. Proceeding on insects, the migration is widespread phenomena in terrestrial arthropods and has evolved independently in group after group. Especially in insects, every group of insects has different pattern of migration. The vast majority of insects migrate by flight as adults, but several have evolved for sea, so displacement by attachment to another organism, for example, a tick, probably if you have a dog or a pet. So whatever the means of the locomotion is, migration in terrestrial arthropods involves specialized behavior. And a good example for this is this bug, so-called milkweed bug, or in Latin Oncopeltus fasciatus, that shows suppression of feeding and reproductive activity during migration, further enhanced by a circadian rhythm which separates them in a daily cycle. So as flight proceeds, the migrants become increasingly sensitive to stimuli which eventually arrest flight. Also, age and reproductive conditions seem to influence the migratory flight. Characteristically, migration occurs after the cuticule has hardened, and for the females it happens prior to oviposition. So some studies refer that the interaction between migration and reproduction to as so-called pre-reproductive process or oogenesis flight syndrome. Prior to flight, the appropriate muscle and enzymes are also undergoing a period of maturation. So this actually means that next to specialized behavior related to migration, something we talked about in the first presentation of migration, there are also some physiological processes that are also adaptation to migration and support it, of course. Well studied and most bombastic migration of insects are, of course, the flying insects, like butterflies. Really famous example of North America butterfly that flies basically through whole North America and even central one from feeding to breeding grounds. The other example is grasshoppers, some loctus species from desert, and they usually live solitary, but in the time of reproduction and migration, they form this huge swarm whose adults have developed wings, unlike non-flying nymphs. So this is next to adaptive behavior, also physiological adaptations to support migration, something we mentioned just before. Next to insects, about arthropods. This group of animals use somewhat these types of migration or transportation, so aerial transport without power flight, or pedestrian and waterborne migration, wind-propelled migration on the surface of water, and then foresea. But one really special migration tactics is seen in spider, and this process is called ballooning. What happens here is that a spider climbs to a high point, stands on its toes, and points its abdomen to the sky, releasing fine silk threads from its spinnerets until lift off occurs. You can find nice videos on YouTube. I couldn't upload them, but you just type in balloon of spiders, ballooning. So basically what the spider does is it makes some kind of a parachute out of its silk threads, and it releases into the wind on a high point, and then the wind just takes it off and take the spider whenever the direction of wind is. Okay, so within this other arthropod of mediapod, this is the animal I'm talking about. They live in the ground, and they are following the seasons through the year. So as they live in the ground, their vertical migration within the ground layer is really accented, going in the deeper and shallower layers of the ground they live in. In the matter of global warming influence, for example, we have a case of last year's migration of red crab in Australia, which usually occurs in October, but since last year the wet season was late, it started in December. This migration happened in December instead of October. And this was a nice example of how the global warming is influencing animals in different ways, because crabs are waiting for wet seasons so they can move from the coast, or they usually live more into the coast, away from the oceans. Next, about fish. Fish migration has evolved to optimize feeding, to avoid unfavorable conditions, and to lesser extent to promote colonization, but the most studied reason for fish migration is fish spawning migration, the one that optimizes reproductive success. So what happens here in general is that young fish usually leave the spawning grounds for areas where they develop into juveniles before joining the adult stock at the feeding ground. Then adults move to the spawning grounds and then return to the feeding ground. Migratory patterns of fish are related to oceanographic factors and to currents of many other things, but there are three major groups of fish in the matter of their migration habit. First are so-called oceanodromous fish, and with this fish, which occur widely throughout the world's ocean, the case is they migrate wholly in the ocean. They differ mainly from one another by the method and extent of the migration. So an example is white tuna are found in the winter around the Azores and the Canary Island, which are close to Africa, where they spawn in spring, and then they tend to migrate northwards to the Gulf of Gascon and afterwards to the waters around Iceland, arriving there in July. So basically what you need to remember is that oceanodromous fish, they just circle within the ocean only. The next group is so-called anadromous fish, and they live in the sea and migrate to fresh water to breed. Their adaptations to conditions of different habitats are precise, particularly with regard to salinity of the water. The salmon is a nice example. So what salmon does is they spawn in cold, clear water of lakes or upper streams, and then eggs are laid in gravel beds. Young stay in fresh water for some time, some species even years. When they are old enough, the new young fish they move to the sea, whereas adults usually remain in the sea for 2 or 3 winters before they get their maturity, and then as so-called girls or adolescents or adults, complete adults, they return to freshwater and spawn after changes occur in color and other external features. Some Atlantic salmon die in freshwater after single spawning. You probably saw this when males get all red and then they die. But other species just go back to the sea. And the last group is so-called catadromous fish, or on the picture Amphidromus, but it's the same thing. So catadromous, it's more common name. They spend most of their lives in fresh water, then migrate to the sea to breed. This type of example would be eel. So European eels are also North American ones. They spawn in warm, saline waters of the Atlantic. And then pelagic eggs develop into so-called leptocephaly. They're transparent leaf-like forms with relatively small head. And then they are carried by current or Gulf Stream to shallow waters of the continental shelf. When they are about 2.5 years old and about 8 centimeters long, metamorphosis occur. So the leptocephali are transformed into so-called alveoles, which are bottom-dwelling, pigmented and forms, and then they arrive in coastal waters as glass eels and begin to swim upstream to in freshwater streams in spring. Their migration upstream is spectacular, as young fish gather by millions, forming a dense mass several kilometers long. In freshwater, the eels grow to full size and they become yellow. So they live as such for example 10 to 15 years before changing into silver eels, and they swim downstream to the sea, return to the spawning ground, or usually Sagrasso Sea, where they die. Next, the amphibians and reptiles. The only migration-like movements of reptiles and amphibians are made during the reproductive period. Frogs and toads then concentrate in particular areas such as ponds and lakes. Thousands travel towards these sites from year to year, and after reproduction, the animals disperse and again settle over their usual range. The range of seasonal movement of most reptiles and amphibians is probably very limited. So generally incapable of traveling any great distances, they respond to unfavorable conditions by lapsing into a stage of lethargy. So they have a different strategy of overcoming the unwanted environmental conditions, not by migrating but adapting to it in a different way. And so they're becoming lethargic. So this type of response makes it possible for them to remain in a particular area even though the conditions are changing and throughout the whole year. Amphibians travel because their lives are split between land and water. That's real specific. So each spring, frogs, toads, salamanders, and so on will make this migration from their land homes, usually in forests, to the ponds or streams. That's one of the main characteristics, is they still are dependent on water for the reproduction. So once they are reaching the pond or a stream, there they breed and lay eggs. Sometimes they go unnoticed, but sometimes amphibians travel in such large numbers that they carpet the ground. So basically the mass migrations. And the next, the reptiles. Well known is the snakes that migrate to and from winter hibernacula, but they also, as we mentioned before, are not really keen to migration. They rather prefer to hibernate through unwanted climate conditions. But some snakes are known to migrate from and to a place of hibernation. And also a nice example is this of a sea turtle, which migrate over long distances where they lay eggs on special beaches and then disperse over the wide area. The cool thing about them is they return every year to the same beach they were born to lay their eggs through their whole life. Now on birds, of course, we mentioned this before, that migration is most evident among birds. Most species, because of their high metabolic rate, require a rich, abundant supply of food at frequent intervals, and such a situation does not always prevail throughout the year in any given region. So birds have thus evolved a highly efficient means for traveling swiftly over long distances with great economy of energy. In most birds, migration involves highly specialized behavior and physiology, like other animals we mentioned before. But in birds, they are categorized by two distinct physiological states. One is called Zugstiposition, the other is called Zugstimung. Zugstiposition, in this situation, the bird is hyperphagic, increasing food intake as much as 40% above normal, and storage the excess of lipid fuel for the migration journey. The inducative stimulus is usually photoperiod. On the other hand, in Zugstimung, the bird undertakes and maintains a migratory flight. In caged birds, this state results in the well-known migratory reluctance. There is a considerable variation in these physiological states within and among species, population, individuals, and in different parts of migratory journey. But the migration flight of birds follows specific routes, sometimes quite well different over long distance. The majority of bird migrants, however, travel along broad airways. So a single population of migrants may scatter over vast territories so as to form a broad front hundreds of miles in length. Such routes are determined not only by geographical factors, for example, rivers, streams, valleys, coasts, and so on, but also ecological conditions, and they also depend upon meteorological conditions, because the birds change their direction of flights in accordance with the direction and force of the wind, so they're saving their energy and usually trying to use as much as they can out of the wind and on current, on whatever they're using for their migration. Most birds are gregarious during migration, even though that display of fierce individuals at all other times, such as many birds of prey and insectivorous passerines. Birds with similar habits sometimes travel together, a phenomenon observed among various species of shorebirds. Flocks, for example, sometimes show a remarkable cohesion, but the most characteristic migration form of geese, ducks, and pelicans is the very good known V shape, the one you can see in this picture. In this case, the point turned in the direction of the flight. In flock of northern bald ibis, each member of the group takes a turn leading the formation of flight, before dropping back to fly in the wake of another to save energy, and this form is really energy efficient because it also takes advantage of the wind currents. Last but not the least, let's talk a bit about mammals. Mammals are unique among migrants in that extensive movements because they are undertaken by a large number of species by all three means of vertebral locomotion, so swimming and walking or flying. This, of course, results from the tremendous adaptive radiation of mammals into all major habitats. So they are, in the matter of migration, the four groups, let's call it like that, four groups of mammals. First would be marine mammals. The general pattern of migration is the same for all large whales, although there may be individual variations of the general theme. So on the picture you can see orcas, but this is the idea of how it looks like. Most of the whale species have their breeding and feeding grounds. They're trying to make the normal temperature. So during the winter they're in their warm habitat, during the summer they're going to their cold habitat, and traveling ups and downs to feed and to give birth and so on. The funny thing is that as you have a horizontal division of the world map going like this, populations from this area and from this area will never meet, because once they are in their warm area, these are in their cold area, they go up, these go up as well. So they're basically switching at the same time up and down. And this is also a type of vertical migration. See, this is funny. This is the whole unclear idea of migration, because as you remember, the first was the Plankton vertical migration, and this is also called the vertical migration of marine mammals as big as whales. Next will be the group of so-called large terrestrial mammals, and this is usually the ungulates that migrate long distances. Nice example, and one of the greatest animal migrations ever recorded, is the so-called animal gnu, or wild beast. What happens here is that they gather around 2 million animals on a round trip for something around as much as 3,000 kilometers at the end of the wet season, so May, June, in East Africa where they live. Wild beasts migrate to dry season areas in response to a lack of surface drinking water. When the rain season begins again, animals quickly move back to their wet season ranges. Factors suspected to affect migration include food abundance, surface water availability, predators, and one really interesting thing is the phosphorus content in grass. Since phosphorus is a critical element for all life forms, but particularly it is important for lactating female bovids. And this, as a result, has, during the rainy season, wild beasts select grazing areas that contain particularly high phosphorus levels. One study actually showed that, in addition to phosphorus, wild beasts are able to select ranges containing grass with relatively high nitrogen content as well. Next would be the bats. The great example of bat migration is the fruit bat. In Africa, they have huge migrations in the period of food burst availability, basically fruit production, so they gather also in millions and traveling for thousands of kilometers. The thing is, it is not really known where they're coming from, because they're basically in September and October they show from nowhere, gathering in millions and travel around Africa to the places where they can find the huge availability of their favorite fruit. Also, the last but not the least is a group of small terrestrial mammals. In this case, the population fluctuation and migration is the most notorious in the Norwegian lemming, the one you can see in the picture. And in this case, studies have shown they have two sorts of migration: a seasonal movement from winter drier habitats to summer wetter ones, and also immigrations at high population density. When these appropriate topographic features concentrate high density, immigrants, the famous mass migration occurs. So when the immigration is different than migration, is because it's not a round trip, it's a one-way trip. It means that when population gets really high in density, some part of the specific population moves on to find their own habitat and to proceed as a different population. And this is something we will talk about in the next presentation, namely metapopulation. So if you would like to hear more about it, please stay with us in the next presentation as well. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.